Dr. Jonathan Edwards was the picture of success. At 47 years old, he was a well-respected psychiatrist who had built a solid career in the heart of a bustling city. A celebrated figure in both the academic world and the media, Jonathan had made a name for himself by pioneering cutting-edge research on mental health. His therapy practices were known for their innovation, and he was considered a trusted voice on psychological well-being. He was always in demand, from corporate clients seeking advice on employee wellness to media outlets looking for expert opinions on high-profile cases. To the public, Jonathan Edwards was a man who had it all. He had a beautiful wife, Charlotte, who was an elegant and poised woman in her early 40s. Together, they shared a large, well-appointed home in an affluent neighborhood. Charlotte, a former professional ballerina who had retired early to support her husband's flourishing career, was known for her grace and charm. Their two children, both in their teens, were exemplary students with promising futures ahead. To anyone looking in from the outside, Jonathan and his family embodied the perfect life, a life that most people could only dream of. But as much as Jonathan appeared to be the ideal family man, those closest to him began to sense that something was off. Charlotte, always supportive of Jonathan's demanding career, had started noticing strange behaviors. He was often late coming home, even from what he claimed were important meetings or conferences. He would become distant at times, retreating into the study for hours on end, leaving Charlotte alone with her thoughts. And when he did come out of his office, there was something unsettling in his eyes. The kindness that once defined him seemed to have faded, replaced with a cold, almost predatory focus. Still, Charlotte brushed these changes off. She attributed them to the stress of Jonathan's work, the pressures of maintaining a successful practice, and the relentless pace of his professional life. She had always stood by him, after all. He was the man she had married, the father of her children, and the man who had once whispered promises of a future filled with happiness. So, she chose to turn a blind eye to the subtle shifts in their relationship. But the cracks in Jonathan's perfect facade were widening, and soon, the darkness lurking beneath the surface would begin to reveal itself. It all began with a disturbing phone call that Charlotte received one evening. "Hello, Mrs. Edwards. This is Detective Harris with the City Police. I'm afraid I need to speak with you about your husband. We have some questions regarding his involvement in a recent case." Charlotte's stomach dropped. The words from the detective echoed in her mind, and she immediately felt a wave of unease. There had been no warning, no signs that her husband was anything but the well-respected psychiatrist everyone thought he was. But as the detective explained further, Charlotte's worst fears were realized. Jonathan's name had come up in connection with a string of unsolved murders. The detective explained that the victims were all women in their late 20s or early 30s who had come to Jonathan for therapy. What stood out to the investigators was the pattern. All of these women had seemingly been making progress in their sessions with him before they disappeared without a trace. Their bodies were discovered weeks later, in various secluded locations, all showing signs of prolonged psychological trauma. But what was more disturbing was the connection between the victims. They all had some sort of psychological issue that Jonathan, as a therapist, would have been privy to, and it appeared that their sessions with him had turned into something more sinister. Charlotte was stunned. She could barely comprehend what she was hearing. Jonathan was a brilliant psychiatrist, a man who had built his career on helping people, on making their lives better. The thought that he could have been involved in such horrific acts seemed impossible. But the evidence was mounting, and the detective's words hung heavily in the air. "We believe he might be involved in a pattern of manipulation, control, and ultimately, murder." As the days passed, Charlotte's world began to unravel. She couldn't escape the gnawing suspicion that something dark and terrible had been hidden from her for years. She started to look back at their life together, searching for signs that could explain the disconnect she had been feeling. Her mind began to race as she thought about all the little things: Jonathan's late nights at the office, the way he had become emotionally distant, the women she had seen him interact with during social events, always a little too intimate, always a little too close. The more Charlotte delved into the mystery, the more her worst fears were confirmed. Jonathan had manipulated everyone, including her. His patients were not the only ones who had been deceived. He had made Charlotte believe that he was the perfect husband, the perfect father, and the perfect psychiatrist. But behind closed doors, He was a man driven by an obsession with control. And as Charlotte soon learned, his facade had been hiding something far more monstrous than she could have ever imagined. Charlotte's investigation led her to a shocking discovery. Hidden deep in Jonathan's study, in a locked drawer, she found a series of journals. At first, they seemed like ordinary notes from a psychiatrist, observations about patients, therapeutic breakthroughs, emotional progress. But as she read further, she realized that they were something far darker. These journals contained detailed accounts of Jonathan's patients, not their struggles or emotional pain, but their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses, and their fears. The entries were chilling, full of language that hinted at manipulation, coercion, and control. One journal entry, in particular, stood out to Charlotte. It was about a woman named Evelyn, a patient who had been struggling with depression. Jonathan had been treating her for several months, but the entry revealed that his treatment had gone beyond mere therapy. He had been building a relationship with her, gaining her trust, and, according to his notes, making her more dependent on me. The entry went on to describe how Jonathan had convinced Evelyn to confront her deepest fears, only to exploit them for his own satisfaction. The final entry read, "Evelyn is lost. I am the only one who can help her. I will make her my next success story." The realization hit Charlotte like a punch to the gut. Jonathan had been using his position of power and trust to control his patients, not help them. And worse still, he had been using his knowledge of their vulnerabilities to manipulate them into a twisted game, one that only he could win. The detective had been right. Jonathan Edwards wasn't just a man who had lost his way. He was a predator, a man who had used his medical expertise as a cover for his dark desires. He had spent years hiding in plain sight, and now, the truth was finally starting to come to light. But Charlotte knew she couldn't stop there. She had to confront him, to expose him for the monster he had become. She couldn't let him destroy any more lives, not if there was a chance to stop him. But as she began to plan her next move, she realized that the battle for justice wouldn't be easy. Jonathan was a master manipulator, and he had spent his life learning how to cover his tracks. To bring him down, Charlotte would have to risk everything. The tension was building, and the more she learned, the more she realized that Jonathan was watching her every move. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the truth was slipping further out of her grasp. Charlotte's search for the truth had only just begun, and already, the depths of Jonathan's deception were far darker than she could have ever imagined. The journals, hidden deep in the study, were just the tip of the iceberg. What she was uncovering wasn't just a man whose actions had slipped beyond his professional boundaries. It was a calculated web of psychological manipulation, control, and death. A predator who had used his prestigious position as a psychiatrist to disguise his true nature. And worse still, he had been playing a dangerous game for years, with no one the wiser. The night Charlotte found the journals, she barely slept. Her mind raced with the terrifying implications of what she had read. Jonathan had manipulated vulnerable patients, pushed them to their emotional breaking points, and used his position of power to satisfy his own sick desires. Evelyn, the woman he had written about in his journals, had become his latest victim. But Evelyn wasn't the only one. Charlotte knew there had to be more. Determined to find out the extent of Jonathan's manipulations, Charlotte decided to do what she had avoided for so long. She would confront the women who had been in Jonathan's care. She would start with Evelyn's family, hoping they might shed some light on what had truly happened during her therapy sessions. But Charlotte wasn't naive. She knew she had to be careful. Jonathan had eyes everywhere, and she wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. The following day, Charlotte called the number listed on Evelyn's file. The phone rang several times before someone picked up. "Hello," a woman's voice answered. "Hi, is this Mrs. Thompson?" Charlotte asked, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," the woman replied, her voice shaky. "Who's calling?" "My name is Charlotte Edwards. I'm married to Dr. Jonathan Edwards. I'm investigating something, and I believe your daughter, Evelyn, might be able to help me understand what's been happening." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft sob. Charlotte's heart sank. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mrs. Thompson finally said. "Evelyn, she's gone. She's gone because of him. He killed her." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. The words were like a punch to her gut. "Please, Mrs. Thompson, I need to know what happened. What did Jonathan do to her?" Charlotte pressed, trying to keep her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "We went to him for help," Mrs. Thompson whispered, her voice trembling. "He made her feel better at first. She started to open up, started to talk about things she'd never mentioned before. But then it changed. She started acting differently. She said he made her feel trapped, like she had to do what he asked. She thought she was getting better, but she was getting worse." Charlotte's blood ran cold. Her mind raced with the implications of what she was hearing. "Mrs. Thompson," Charlotte said quietly, "did she ever mention anything about him wanting to control her? Did she talk about anything that might suggest he was using her?" The pause on the other end of the line felt like an eternity. Then Mrs. Thompson spoke, her voice breaking. She said that he had a way of getting inside her head, that he made her feel like she owed him something, like if she didn't do what he wanted, she'd be broken forever. And one night, after she came back from a session, she told me she couldn't see him anymore. She said she had to stop, but it was too late. She was already lost. Charlotte's heart shattered for Evelyn. She had been trapped by Jonathan, manipulated into believing that everything was her fault. And now, the truth was clear. Jonathan had pushed her past her breaking point. He had used his position of trust to tear her apart. "Mrs. Thompson," Charlotte said, her voice filled with determination, "I need to ask you for something. I need to speak to the authorities about what happened. Will you help me? Will you tell them everything you just told me?" There was a long silence, but eventually, Mrs. Thompson agreed. She told Charlotte that she would do whatever it took to see Jonathan held accountable for what he had done to her daughter. Together, they would ensure that Jonathan could no longer hurt anyone else. With Mrs. Thompson's testimony, Charlotte had a breakthrough. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Jonathan wasn't just a predator in the shadows. He had been hiding in plain sight, using his charm and his professional status to manipulate everyone around him. He had made people believe in his goodness, his expertise, all while taking control of their lives. But Charlotte knew she couldn't stop there. There were still more women out there who had fallen victim to Jonathan's manipulations. Women who had trusted him, believed in him, and had their lives ruined. It was time for Charlotte to find them. Her investigation continued for weeks, and every day, the truth became clearer. Jonathan's power didn't just lie in his intelligence or his profession. It lay in his ability to manipulate the people around him, to make them feel like they owed him everything. He used his patients' vulnerabilities to gain control, to dominate them. He was a master of deception, and he had left a trail of destruction in his wake. Charlotte's obsession with uncovering the truth grew stronger with each passing day. She spoke to more families, uncovered more hidden secrets, and slowly pieced together a dark history of Jonathan's actions. But the deeper she dug, the more dangerous things became. Derek, as she began to call him in her mind, was no longer just her husband. He was a monster hiding behind a carefully constructed facade. And she was the only one who knew the truth. But she wasn't alone in this fight. Detective Lisa Harris, the officer who had helped Charlotte make sense of the initial investigation, became her ally in the pursuit of justice. Together, they shared the weight of the evidence Charlotte had uncovered. Lisa had been working tirelessly on the case, piecing together a string of cold cases that seemed to follow the same pattern as Jonathan's crimes. The final breakthrough came when Charlotte and Lisa uncovered a series of recordings that Jonathan had made during his therapy sessions. These tapes were chilling. In one of them, Jonathan could be heard manipulating a patient, pushing them to the brink of emotional collapse. In another, he made subtle threats disguised as advice. The tapes were damning evidence of the way Jonathan had preyed on the most vulnerable. The authorities were finally starting to take action. Jonathan's empire was crumbling. The walls of deception he had built around himself were beginning to fall, and with each new piece of evidence, the truth was coming closer to light. But as the investigation drew to a close, Charlotte knew that the hardest part was yet to come. She had already lost so much to Jonathan's manipulation. The damage he had caused would never be undone. But for the first time in her life, Charlotte had the power to make things right. To take back control, not just for herself, but for all the women Jonathan had destroyed. As the case against Jonathan Edwards moved toward its final reckoning, Charlotte stood firm. She knew the truth, and she was ready to make sure it was heard. No more lies. No more manipulation. No more hiding in the shadows. Jonathan Edwards, once a respected psychiatrist, was now a man trapped in his own web of lies. The facade he had built for years, His carefully constructed image of a compassionate doctor was crumbling under the weight of the truth. The women he had manipulated, the lives he had destroyed, the patients he had preyed upon, all of it was coming to light. And now, as the walls closed in, Jonathan was facing the one thing he had feared the most, the consequences of his actions. Charlotte stood at the forefront of the investigation. With the support of Detective Lisa Harris, she had uncovered the damning evidence that linked Jonathan to a string of disappearances and deaths, all tied to his role as a trusted therapist. But even as the investigation moved forward, Charlotte knew that Jonathan would stop at nothing to protect his empire. He was a master manipulator, and she could feel the weight of his power bearing down on her. It was a race against time. The police had gathered enough evidence to make a move, but Jonathan had become increasingly erratic as the investigation gained momentum. The calm, collected man Charlotte had once known was now a shell of himself, a man desperate to preserve his reputation and his freedom at any cost. The phone call came one morning as Charlotte was reviewing her notes. It was Detective Harris, her voice tight with urgency. "Charlotte, we've got him. He's been arrested. But there's a catch," Lisa said, her tone grim. "Jonathan's not going down without a fight. He's been orchestrating something from behind the scenes. We don't know what exactly, but we have reason to believe that he's planned a way out. He's too clever for his own good." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. She had always known that Jonathan was dangerous, but now, with him cornered, his true nature was being revealed. "Is he going to escape again?" Charlotte asked, dread creeping into her voice. "We've got everything in place. The team is watching him closely, but we need to move quickly," Lisa replied. "We'll need your testimony. The evidence you've gathered is crucial to ensuring that he doesn't slip through the cracks." Charlotte felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. She had been through so much already, but now it was time to finish what she had started. She was no longer just a victim. She was the one who would bring Jonathan to justice. As the day of Jonathan's trial approached, the tension in Charlotte's life reached a boiling point. She knew this was the moment of reckoning. The man who had manipulated, controlled, and broken so many lives was finally going to face the consequences of his actions. But the closer she got to the courtroom, the more she realized just how much was at stake. She had spent countless hours reviewing the evidence, speaking with witnesses, and preparing herself for the day when she would testify. But nothing could prepare her for the moment when she would come face to face with the man who had ruined her life. The trial was set to begin, and the courtroom was filled with tension. Charlotte arrived early, taking a seat in the front row, her hands trembling in her lap. The air was thick with anticipation. This was it. The moment when Jonathan would finally be held accountable for the horrors he had inflicted on so many. As the proceedings began, Charlotte sat quietly, watching as the prosecution laid out their case. The evidence was overwhelming. Tapes of Jonathan's therapy sessions, testimonies from victims, and the shocking details of the many lives he had destroyed. But despite the evidence, Jonathan remained calm. His defense attorney argued that the tapes were taken out of context, that Jonathan had only been trying to help his patients. But Charlotte knew the truth. The tapes didn't lie. Jonathan's actions had been deliberate and malicious. When it was time for Charlotte to testify, her nerves threatened to overtake her. She had spent so long gathering evidence, piecing together the puzzle of Jonathan's twisted world. But now, with the spotlight on her, she had to be strong. For herself, for the victims, for the women who had never gotten the justice they deserved. Taking a deep breath, she stood and walked to the witness stand. Her hands were steady as she held the papers in front of her, her eyes locked on Jonathan, who sat across the room. He didn't flinch. His eyes met hers, cold and calculating, as if he was still in control of the situation. But Charlotte wasn't intimidated. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. She began speaking, her voice clear and unwavering. "Jonathan Edwards manipulated me, just as he manipulated every other woman in this room. He took his position as a trusted professional and used it to control and destroy lives. He made me believe that everything was my fault, that I was the one who needed help. But now I see the truth. He's the one who needed help. He's the one who's broken." As Charlotte spoke, she could feel the weight of the truth behind her words. She wasn't just exposing Jonathan for what he had done to her. She was exposing him for what he had done to countless other women. Her testimony was the final piece of the puzzle. The pieces that Jonathan had worked so hard to hide were now laid bare for the world to see. The prosecutor then presented the evidence, the tapes, the journals, the testimonies from other victims. One by one, the pieces of Jonathan's carefully constructed lie fell apart. His empire of manipulation, control, and death crumbled under the weight of the truth. But even as the trial moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Charlotte knew that Jonathan would never truly be defeated. He would always find a way to manipulate the truth, to twist the narrative in his favor. But this time, he had been exposed. This time, the truth would win. As the trial concluded and the jury deliberated, Charlotte left the courtroom with a sense of finality. Jonathan's reign of terror had come to an end. He had been exposed for the monster he was, and now, justice was finally within reach. But Charlotte knew that the battle was far from over. Jonathan had spent years hiding behind his profession, behind his charm, behind his reputation. But now, the world knew the truth, and that was something he could never take back. The courtroom door slammed shut behind Charlotte as she stepped into the hallway. The final step had been taken. Jonathan would face the consequences of his actions. And for Charlotte, the journey was over. But the scars would remain forever. She had fought for justice, and she had won. But the cost had been high. This case proves that even the most respected individuals can harbor the darkest secrets. Justice may take time, but it always prevails in the end. Do you think Jonathan's trial was fair? Was justice truly served in the end? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more gripping true crime stories as we uncover the dark secrets hiding behind closed doors.